porterò via pochissimo tempo a questo incontro che ritengo di grandissimo interesse e credo che meriti tutto il tempo che noi abbiamo deciso di destinare adesso. Ho però il dovere di portare a Marilyn Robinson il saluto del sindaco della città di Ravenna, dell'assessore alla cultura della città di Ravenna e il mio saluto personale di direttore delle istituzioni culturali del comune di Ravenna, perché I hope you understand me, but I prefer to say this in Italian. Per noi è veramente un grande onore avere Marilyn Robinson, anche se in questo modo, diciamo così, attraverso uno schermo qui a Ravenna. È un grande onore perché io personalmente, ma anche la città, ecco, hanno molto da imparare dai suoi libri e anche il modo in cui io personalmente, ma diciamo anche la città di Ravenna, ha deciso di celebrare Dante nel settecentenario della sua morte. Questo mi piacerebbe spiegarglielo con molte più parole, ma dipende molto, ha molto a che vedere con il suo modo di scrivere, con il suo modo di ragionare, con i pensieri che escono dai suoi libri. E quindi io la ringrazio non soltanto perché lei è una grande scrittrice, perché ci fa questo onore, ma perché credo che proprio il suo pensiero, le cose che lei dice, le cose che lei scrive, sono state importanti per noi e per il modo in cui noi abbiamo provato a rileggere Dante in questo settecentenario. Quindi grazie ancora a Marilyn Robinson e avevo promesso che sarei stato breve, forse non lo sono stato del tutto, ma a questo punto mi fermo qui. Grazie ancora.
Grazie, e allora chiedo al pubblico italiano in sala e a casa di avere pazienza perché parlerò in inglese, ma per non tagliare fuori Marilyn Robinson, e poi naturalmente tradurrò in italiano. So, good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to introduce you Miss Marilyn Robinson. She doesn't need any further introduction because she is very famous also in Italy. Buon pomeriggio a tutti, a casa e in sala. Sono veramente felice e onorata di presentare Marilyn Robinson, anche se non ha bisogno di ulteriori presentazioni perché è davvero famosa anche in Italia. Robinson is a novelist and an essayist. Across her career, she received a lot of awards, including the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction in 2005. She's known for her novels Housekeeping and Gilead, noted for their depiction of faith and rural life in US. Marilyn Robinson è una romanziera e anche un'autrice di saggi. Durante la sua felice carriera ha ricevuto moltissimi premi, fra cui il premio Pulitzer nel 2005. I suoi romanzi più conosciuti sono Housekeeping, tradotto in italiano con il titolo Le cure domestiche, e Gilead, che sono particolarmente apprezzati per la descrizione della fede e della vita rurale negli Stati Uniti. She is also the author of many non-fiction works about history, literature and religion, and she has been professor of English and creative writing at university. È anche autrice di diversi saggi che trattano di storia, di letteratura e di religione, e è stata, ora in pensione, professore di inglese e anche professore di letteratura creativa, di scrittura creativa all'università. E ora due parole anche per presentare chi è presente appunto in sala. I'm Sebastiana Nobili, I'm here with my colleague Niccolò Maldina. We teach Italian literature and particularly Dante's Commedia at the University.
Recording in progress.
Sono Sebastiana Nobili e sono qui con il mio collega Niccolò Maldina, insegniamo letteratura italiana e visto che siamo a Ravenna soprattutto insegniamo ai nostri studenti la commedia di Dante come sede dell'Università di Bologna. First of all, I would like to thank the city of Ravenna which supported the event, the Classense Library where we are now in a magnificent sala dantesca, and the Department of Cultural Heritage of our University in Ravenna. Quindi prima di tutto voglio ringraziare la città di Ravenna, il sindaco, il comune che hanno supportato questo evento così importante, di grande prestigio, la Biblioteca Classense, dove ci troviamo ora, siamo nella splendida sala dantesca che fu inaugurata nel 1921, nuovamente adibita proprio al culto dantesco, e il Dipartimento di Beni Culturali dell'Università di Bologna che ha sede a Ravenna. I would like to thank the Italian publisher of Robinson's novels, Einaudi, and particularly la dottoressa Carla Polzot for this opportunity, the Association of the Italianists and the President, Gino Ruozzi, the Gruppo Dante of the association, coordinated by Alberto Casadei, that organized the series of lectures titled In a Name of Dante. Quindi voglio innanzitutto ringraziare l'editore italiano dei romanzi di Marilyn Robinson, ossia Einaudi, e in particolare davvero sentitamente la dottoressa Carla Polzot di Einaudi per questa opportunità e per avere fatto tutto il lavoro di tessitura e di contatto con la scrittrice, e poi l'Associazione degli Italianisti Italiani, l'ADI, con il suo presidente Gino Ruozzi, e in particolare il Gruppo Dante di questa associazione perché sotto il coordinamento di Alberto Casadei ha organizzato questa serie di incontri che si intitola Nel nome di Dante gli scrittori contemporanei rileggono la commedia. Aggiungo, the Italian text of the lectures will be published in an upcoming volume printed by Rizzoli. Il testo italiano, la traduzione italiana delle principali, delle più importanti conferenze contenute nella serie Nel nome di Dante sarà pubblicato in un volume di prossima uscita, settembre 2021, pubblicato da Rizzoli. Today, Miss Robinson is going to read her lecture, which she has written specifically for this occasion. Ci tengo a dire che oggi Marilyn Robinson ci leggerà la sua conferenza che ha scritto, è un lavoro originale che ha scritto per questa occasione, e quindi la ringraziamo doppiamente. During the lecture, the Italian audience will be able to read the translation of Eva Kampmann in real time. Durante la conferenza il pubblico italiano potrà seguire leggendo la traduzione di Eva Kampmann, anche questa fatta per l'occasione e anticipata parzialmente sulla lettura del Corriere della Sera domenica scorsa, che scorrerà mentre la nostra prestigiosa ospite leggerà. Quindi sono davvero onorata a questo punto di dare la parola a Marilyn Robinson. I'm pleased in that context to give the floor to Miss Marilyn Robinson. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Yes. I'm very happy to have had my attention drawn to Dante in this way because I hadn't really realized before how very important he was and is, and also what a completely admirable, wonderful person he seems to have been. In any case, I will confess that in writing this essay, I have felt a little overwhelmed by my subject. For me, as a North American whose studies have focused much more narrowly on Northern Europe than I was ever aware, a great many things I have learned or discovered here are newer to me than they ought to be. Just when I thought I might be able to start thinking of myself as educated, another planet has swum into my ken. I'm very grateful that it did. It is important these days to remember, while we can, what our civilization has consisted in. Dante's liberality, this seems to be his favorite word and his strongest impulse, has made him its epitome. My education has made me aware that I, along with a great many others, am the inheritor of a powerful tradition of producing and attending to literature. I've heard many writers wonder why we do what we do. It is difficult work, and rewards are at best uncertain. Whatever answers these writers might offer themselves, they know that much of what they do is anticipated in what earlier writers have done. Society has learned to expect writers. They are an acknowledged guild with a strong general idea of what a writer's life might be long before they themselves have become writers. They might be hoping for no more than an approving glance and a trinket or two from their great patron, the reading public, or they may be toiling away at a grave and ambitious masterwork that they will be reluctant to describe to anyone before its ungainliness has been tamed, assuming it ever will be. And both of them really are writers. The old Puritans used to say on the matter of uncertain faith, a spark is as truly fire as a conflagration. The word writer is very forgiving, the line between authenticity and pretense being effectively undiscoverable. In this, we are all beneficiaries of the sustaining fact that modern society expects there will be writers, some of them interesting. If I suggest a little depletion of urgency in the books and poetry we produce, habit and safety can have that effect. Of course, habit and safety can also come to an end. Our present crises raise questions about what we do and why it matters, whether there is something the cultures that have kept us in reserve actually need from us. For Dante, nothing was to be assumed, even though his training as a poet involved deep immersion in convention. He took his place among a constellation of secular poets exploring the same narrow conventions as he did, working in the shadow of prestigious Latin and feeling the influence of Provençal. But he dwelt on his own words, studied them to extract their fullest meaning, as if they came from a deeper place than his intentions, as if they were oracular. His faith in the value of it all produced a deep originality in him, not an individual distinctiveness, the usual understanding of this word, but a share in the impetus that has made human beings create in language through unnumbered generations. This impulse was full and fresh and urgent in him, and invested with a seriousness that involved both discipline and boundless generosity. All of us who even pretend to feel that energy, though out of dread of inadequacy we might pass it off as mere ambition, know that it is of a kind with the dearest freshness deep down things, in the words of the poet Gerard Manley Hopkins. We feel the generative force that withstands everything we do to weary and exhaust it. This is a wonderful experience that, for us, falls into the giant category of things we do not query. But suppose it might actually tell us something essential. What is it that enthralls Dante so deeply that words are more than themselves, that allusions imply whole discourses on philosophy? That a young girl, simply by existing in fact and then in memory, can have a meaning that makes absolute demands on a poet's ability to express it. The structure of the universe is arbitrary, which is to say it expresses a will rather than systems of law or necessity. So nothing is without meaning, and everything has inexpressible meaning. This kind of thinking, with its suggestions of eternal mourning, could not have been culturally alien to Dante. In the beginning was the word was with God, and the Word was God. Dante's cosmos is so constructed as to reflect the effective will of God toward humankind. This accounts for everything without remainder. Reason does not stand apart from it to appraise its operations, but is subsumed by it. We moderns are dwellers in a quantum world, not absolutely unlike Dante's. Our reality, if we choose to be aware of it, is subatomically sensitive to will or perception, which suggests a remote likeness to the theological cosmos proposed by the poet. Dante's universe is sustained by the active will of God, while ours is sustained somehow. We modern humans are anomalous in the universe of our understanding, though one impressive claim ha- we might make to having a place here is the astonishing reach of our minds, which have attained to heights or distances that compare interestingly with Dante's spheres. Wonder has become our certitude, or it ought to. Where everything is improbable, nothing is improbable. I say this so we can credit powerful intuitions like Dante's that poetry is a mediator between absolute reality and our minds, or at least that we have minds, and that they, with language, mediate between ourselves and reality. The profound affinity between the mind and the world can be expressed in words and must be. And what we create can carry the mists and fragrances of that first creation. If science says nothing to affirm this, equally impressive is the fact that science says nothing to preclude it. Dante was not encumbered as we have been by the thought that knowledge by its nature cancels awe. I try to describe to myself what I mean by Dante's originality, a quality that is palpable in him before he sets out to envision for the first time in common language the whole luminous creation. Ancient David, son of Jesse, when he was the fugitive leader of a band of misfits and malcontents, must have waked on a mountainside after an anxious night, glad to have lived to see the sunrise. With thee is the fountain of life, in thy light do we see light. Who knows what a haggard youth in a world of trouble might be thinking in the extremes of his loneliness and peril? Quoting again, if I say, let only darkness cover me, and the light around me be night, even the darkness is not dark to thee. The night is bright as the day, for darkness is as light with thee. We can imagine David, unlikely as it must have seemed at the time, in the midst of harrowing misfortune, drawing fresh conclusions about the nature of God, doing the primary work of theology and poetry. Had any mortal before him ever thought that there is a light within which light itself is seen? David, Dante, and Melville are contemporaries, all of them uh, seeming to have heard, let there be, and there was. The very scale of their thinking is a great consecration of the world they encounter. In his prose writing, Dante insists that knowledge without modifier is a marvelous liberating gift. His understanding of reality as a single whole system means that not only knowledge itself, but the process of its articulation is charged with an autonomous value and beauty, so that in each field of knowledge, writing is a star full of light which manifests that field of knowledge. Quoting Dante. This in the course of discussing classical philosophy. I learned from a note that it is the same refined and powerful language, Virgil's, that helps the Dante figure find his way out of the dark wood. There must be some analogy between Dante's experience of language and ours, unlike as they seem. He is not speaking here about his beloved Florentine vernacular, but about the Latin of Boethius and Cicero. It is rarely that I would not tend to see such language as a more or less transparent veil over a field of knowledge. I believe I have never seen it full of light. Of course, being a master in the use of language might have inclined Dante to a very high view of its capacities. And these capacities, if they were trusted, would yield a great richness of apprehension and comprehension, which would produce in turn an exalted view of being itself and of God as its maker and mover. Meaning must have its referent, and so this sequence can have value only within a reality it actually does illuminate. And what it reveals is a reality of great intrinsic beauty and nothing more beautiful than in the fact that we can experience it. These are my thoughts, not Dante's, though in reading him I have become aware of how much slack, how much dead air there is in our conception of virtually everything. Since the whole system of being actually is of one substance, at some level language must have the same kind of reality as flesh or stone, if only on the principle that ultimately, so far as science is concerned, there are not two kinds of reality. Still, I struggle to imagine for language the potency and substantiality Dante finds in it. In the traditions of thought in which I have been educated, there are, as if, ontological spaces vast enough to suggest that they signify qualitative differences between and among the great variety of nameable things, say, elegance, the force of gravity, and reasonable doubt. If language is a faithful mediator among all things, then it does participate in reality as profoundly as Dante suggests. As the treasury and instrument of knowledge, it is especially to be revered. This can only be true. I have always tried to respect language, to make good use of it. Now I have a new way of seeing how little I have been asking of myself. Dante's celebration of language at its height is a celebration of the vernacular. Traveling Italy to find the most beautiful of the dialects of its cities and regions, he settled on his own Tuscan, having concluded that there is a beauty of the vernacular that is not realized in any local version of it. It is a music rising from the land, from the lives that are passing in it, from the wit and grievance and love and mourning that flow in and ebb away and are renewed. In much of Europe in the 14th century, there was great interest in the language of the unlearned, an interest which was deeply friendly to its speakers, the great mass of people, including the very poor. The North was tormented then with famine, plague, and war, which makes the interest of great writers, Chaucer, Langland, Gower, Lydgate, in working in the vernacular only more striking. Wandering was banned, vagrants were hanged, and when John Wycliffe translated the many verses in the Old Testament urging kindness to strangers, where the Vulgate had peregrinus, a word in Latin with the legal meaning of alien, Wycliffe wrote comeling. I take the diminutive ending to be a softening of the word suited to a commonplace claim on popular mercy. In my next life, I will become a thorough scholar of the 14th century. Right after I finish law school and master a musical instrument and have become fluent in Italian. For now, I can only say that the love of Dante for the spoken language casts another light on the period. Wycliffe's devotion to English and its speakers was primarily pious and compassionate. But for him and all the others, there was the enviable experience of truly hearing it, an aesthetic experience that finally transformed Western literature and culture. Now we are all writers in the vernacular, too often unaware of the beauty of our medium. Dante's name appears in Chaucer's House of Fame. It is remarkable that reputation could have traveled so far, so quickly, across languages, and despite the isolation of the groups in the cities and universities who would have any interest in literary reputation. Chaucer mocks fame as if it were discredited already, a tawdry pretense, this in a world without print and without much in the way of literacy. The Vita Nova should be looked at as an interpretive approach to the sonnets of Shakespeare. By the time of Elizabeth, Dante's influence would have been broad and diffuse, directly or indirectly present. Shakespeare did not put these poems in the order they have had since they were first published, nor did he have any part in their publication. They seem always to have been read as being autobiographical, though this would be a great departure from his practice in other work. Some of them seem to have been affectionate notes, perhaps to his wife, who would not see him at all over long periods of time and who was significantly older than he, which might move him to gentle assurances having to do with the possible fading of her eternal summer. Most of them, I believe, conjure a character in what is in effect a brief soliloquy, exploring the inwardness of the speaker, as the Romance poets did, with the great difference that they were summoning emotions they claimed as their own, stereotyped as they were, while the playwright might have been making sketches of friends or strangers in a public house, or of someone mentioned in Holinshed. The given of the Romance style is that a person or a circumstance can fill the speaker with overwhelming joy or grief or shame. Inwardness can be invaded by things outwardly perceived, the objects of fascination or obsession. The interpretations that are read as bearing on Shakespeare himself, his passions and rivalries, seem to be confections of a kind that are hardly to be reconciled with the discipline apparent in the writing of the poems or with Shakespeare's apparent indifference to them. Of the few things that can be said with confidence about Shakespeare's personal life, the first is that he was not at all casual about allowing access to it. There are much more interesting points of comparison between the two writers. Dante is counted as the first major writer in a European vernacular. Chaucer and his contemporaries appear about a century later, then Marlowe and Shakespeare. The popular languages emerged as the language of masterpieces, bodies of work that have never been surpassed, never equaled. Dante was giving his readers their own spiritual universe, sin, purgation, and salvation, not only pondered and made vivid, but also, since he was Dante, explained. Shakespeare gave his audience the history of the 100 Years' War in France and then the dynastic wars that had convulsed their country, the epic of the origins of modern England. In both cases, the gift was the creation of a comprehensible model of reality, political in one case, spiritual in the other. The comprehensiveness of both projects is consistent with the fact that opening theology or history to the mass of people was a great restitution. The dominance of Latin had excluded the great majority of people from the learning their souls naturally desired. To prove him right, there was what soon became the profound impact of Dante's Divine Comedy in Italy and throughout Europe, and in Shakespeare's time, the surge in literacy and printing that filled the streets with controversial pamphlets on national issues. The importance of the vernacular to the emergence of the modern world. For these purposes, the countries that have made some approach to the standards of liberal democracy can never be overstated. At the beginning of the Convivio, Dante quotes Aristotle's saying that since knowledge is the ultimate perfection of our soul, in which our ultimate happiness resides, we are all naturally subject to a desire for it. Is this true? First of all, this estimable pagan assumes a soul and the desire to perfect it. I'm not sure this thought is wholly extinct among us, though we might articulate it differently. I assume many of us want, at least, to minimize our deficiencies. People must be forgiven for the fact that in their little span of life, their culture does not help them to a particularly ennobling view of themselves. The ebbing away of context has meant we no longer look to the soul to find human dignity or beauty, though we still might think of it as imperiled by sin, threatened by loss, and unmitigated vulnerability from certain points of view, and a marginal figure in any case. Dante incorporated the science of his time to depict a cosmos shaped around souls, their transgressions, and their merits. It can hardly be called a celestial kingdom or a city of God. The whole system of being is, for him, the theater of God's justice, which has no other object than to make real the ultimate fates of souls. The nature of sin is visible in the punishments that are appropriate to it, in the atonements undergone to cleanse it away. The Dante of the poem finally enters the region of absolute holiness, the light of light that will enfold the spirits in their redeemed state, as they are in essence, without blemish, unspeakably beautiful. Any soul contains in itself every possibility that the universe contains, because creation is addressed to humankind. Being will in time make real as experience everlastingly, whether in hell or heaven, the truest nature of every life. For all its severities or because of them, this construct is a great expression of the centrality of the human soul, a grand statement of the faith that what we are is astonishing and what we do matters. That the cosmos itself is fundamentally devoted to divine justice, and that we are all important actors in the world are excellent assumptions in which to form or govern a society. And Dante, exiled from his beloved city, never ceased to think of it. But most central is the belief in the soul. To take it to be true that when words are written or spoken, a soul speaks and a soul hears, is to lift poetry above the highest levels of meaning we can imagine for it now. We moderns have fairly thoroughly deprived ourselves of the thought of the soul, of life more enduring than our bodies, more precious than anything safety can secure, somehow better attuned than ourselves to grace and truth. This dear spirit and companion is banished, so we are told, and we moderns are unaccountably inclined to believe what we are told, especially when it involves deprivation. If we cannot share the belief without which the corpus of Dante's work is not to be imagined, we can still consider certain of the consequences of that belief. One is the extraordinary beauty he can see and feel in a human presence. Beatrice, as it happened, though every poet of his time and place found a version of this aesthetic power in some particular lady of his acquaintance. On one hand, this seems not wholly Catholic or Christian. The small G God called love, who is nothing like Caritas, involves the gallant in this glorious affliction, adoration that will never be reciprocated, will quite likely be slighted or scorned. I take it that the man so afflicted does gain a certain refinement as a result of it. In all candor, I find the conventions of romantic love hard to understand. It seems to idealize a complex of private emotions, the writer's own sensitivity, much more than it does the lady who is claimed as its object. Still, for long years in the early formation of European literature, it enthralled important poets in Italy and far beyond. It is the seedbed of Western literature. In Dante's case, this obsessively ritualized experience, taken from pagan Ovid, becomes an occasion for contemplating what, in his Christian understanding, a human being is. The Beatrice of the Vita Nova is the Beatrice of the Paradiso, a transfiguration never hinted at in the persons of other poets' ideal ladies. These idealizations recall the figure of the Virgin Mary, but they are not Mary, and no merging of the lady with the Virgin is suggested. The idealizations do not make these ladies other than human. However, they are exalted above our idea of the human. This is consistent with the fact that for Dante, creation itself is formed around the human moral pilgrimage. Therefore, properly seen, any one of us is indeed exalted, even if this is reflected in the everlasting gravity of our sins. The condign punishment of his hell re-expresses the character of our sins and crimes with an exactness that, in effect, humanizes hell itself, and so with purgatory. Paradiso proceeds from flawed virtue to exalted participation in the highest states of revelatory comprehension, where Beatrice, theology, steps aside and the glory of the Most High subsumes human understanding, being truth itself. While on one hand, the limitations of understanding are made clear, on the other hand, theology is gloriously affirmed and rewarded by the vision of the absolute, to which the Dante of the poem finally comes. The poem depicts the scale and competence of the human mind and soul in the heroes of spiritual history to be found in the upper regions of paradise, and also in the accomplishment of the poem itself, attributed by the poem to the mortal and historical, though fictive, Dante. Reading Dante, I sometimes feel that the Renaissance has finally come to an end, that the last light from that supernova has finally passed away. And at other times, reading Dante, I feel that his joyous liberality will not be eclipsed, that it can illuminate the words we seem to have lost so that we see the beauty of the vision behind them. I do suggest that the practice of reading only at the Inferno, to the exclusion of the rest of the Commedia as well as of his writings on language and culture, is an abuse of a poet so eager to recruit every resource to a project even larger than an account of the cosmos. Dante's insatiable passion to explain should discourage the practice of curtailing his work to its most teachable part, presumably, though the best of him is lost, that is, his central intention is lost. Now, when generous Dante has so much to teach us, liberality first of all. When I visit an older university or library in America, I'm struck by the care that has been taken to make the place grand and beautiful, like and different from every other place of its kind. In America in the 19th century, we developed an architectural style called collegiate Gothic. Buildings in this style usually dominate the center of a campus, composing it aesthetically, serving as a sort of synecdoche for the whole institution. It is really not more anachronistic than the Gothic design of the British Houses of Parliament, which were also built in the mid-19th century. Institutions conjure with appearances, staking claims to antiquity and authority with vaults and spires. These aging, well-loved halls of learning, sometimes ivy-clad, always costly to maintain, have meant for generations that in the precinct of their influence, something extraordinary will happen. They have no place in American cultural history other than this place that has been made for them as the quite arbitrary expressions of an ideal of higher learning. Now the value of the humanities, once as central to any of these schools as its university hall, is being questioned, even rather crudely challenged. And what are the humanities? They are the feast that Dante spread for the joy of his numberless guests and for the perfection of their souls. All the venerable collegiate beauty was prepared not so long ago to welcome guests to this banquet. The excess and overplus, who really needs a spire, suggested liberality, access to and participation in the lore the world cherished. It was the Renaissance that gave humane learning its aura. No one exemplifies the power and beauty of it so vividly as Dante did already in the 14th century. What a potent light it was to illuminate so much of the earth for so long. Dante and all those before and after him who have created beauty and demonstrated brilliance have given us good Renaissance grounds to love one another, to obey that last commandment, which has very much the sound of a final plea. At best, we have failed terribly, as we all know. The list of wars and enormities is long, of insults and injustices endless. Still, the fact that the nations so furiously rage together has been known for a very long time. We have had a great many reasons to be disheartened, and we have our humane traditions as proof of what can be accomplished and valued despite all. Of course, like anyone, I lack perspective to say with confidence that this time is different from others. When I went to public high school in a small town in the mountains of the American West, I studied Latin. I was told that an educated person should have some knowledge of that language. We read about the fall of the Republic because we also were a republic. Latin is no longer taught there or elsewhere, and the historical awareness of students reaches back only about as far as to the Kennedy assassination. I am grateful for my brush with Latin. This is not to say that a different curriculum would not have given me other things to be grateful for. What interests me in retrospect is the authority of the phrase "an educated person." When Dante talked about the learned, he meant people with privileged access to the store of knowledge most valued by the culture. The fact that a schoolgirl read Cicero on the far fringe of a barely imagined continent could only mean that many barriers had fallen. The fact that the girl was told and believed that she was improving herself as she toiled away at declensions and conjugations meant that what Dante assumed, she assumed also, never knowing the idea had a history, never knowing she was in his debt and Aristotle's as well. To be an educated person was an individual choice, an ideal to be realized in any number of ways when conferring practical benefits at no greater rate than other choices. This all took place in a public school to which currently influential terms like elite did not at all apply. So I, was a late arriving guest at Dante's banquet. I don't want to generalize too freely, but it is my experience as a professor and a lecturer that the banquet as metaphor, with its suggestions of a kind of sociable joyousness and generosity, no longer applies in most academic settings. The promise intended in the fanciful archaism of traditional college architecture that this place was a little apart from the ordinary world has been forgotten, or it seemed to have been before the pandemic, before the great hiatus that isolated and stilled so many institutions. We were all desperately busy up to the very moment when we found that everything had changed. We were accustomed to we were accustomed to being overstretched until suddenly everything went slack. Merely to know such a thing could happen should make us wonder what that system was. It seemed to make such absolute demands on our lives, our energy and time, and even to supplant our aspirations with a cautious hope that we and our children, and presumably their children, would not founder in its accelerating, in the accelerating dynamism of the global economy. I've read about the terrific winds that constantly circle other planets. We, being spared this affliction, created an affliction of our own, a force that drove everything before it, or a sort of Dantean hell where the character of a crime is manifest in its endless punishment. And now here we are in a sudden stillness, learning by the day that the negligence and injustice that flourished in all that urgency possess a dynamic of their own, threatening to make instability permanent as the pandemic takes deeper hold on areas of poverty, the vast strongholds of contagion that have been prepared for it in the service of what really was, for all the theorizing and optimizing that surrounded it, plain old greed. There is an allegorical clarity in the history I have described. We know that this economic system has created stupendous wealth in certain hands, This has been accepted as a side effect of a natural or at least a rational order. The extreme massing of wealth was not the result of design or intent, perhaps. It was certainly not an inefficiency, since the perfect functioning of free market principles put it above that kind of thing. First, it was a side effect, a beautifully rational global system. Then it became a proof of virtue or wisdom in the terms of the newly prevailing order. True, the system tended to lavish its rewards on gimmick makers, their heirs, their stockholders. Still, the ultra-rich somehow consider themselves deputized to exert gargantuan influence on public life, as if from the heights of virtue or wisdom. The startling thought about this is that the public were in on it. A great many of them worked too much for too little pay. Virtually all of them lived with continuous threats to their or their children's livelihoods. They knew that the natural and humane ecologies of this fragile planet, how often do we remind ourselves of Earth's fragility, were being ravaged, and it all seemed to make sense to people. What has it profited us to lose the whole world and lose our own souls too? We have made a bargain far worse than the one Jesus posed. The only clog on utter exploitation, now that technology has advanced so far, are humane considerations. In principle, the right to justice or to a reasonable standard of life. These things have been swept aside through the whole of history until the modern period, which has had its own pathologies, but has at least acknowledged an intrinsic worth in the individual, which society should respect. I believe that our universe, like Dante's, has until recently been based on the belief in the soul. The various ideologies and anthropologies, those attempts at the explanation of everything, have stripped out the soul from their account of reality. The radical individuation that is resistant to generalization and would make each one of us of interest to God. Minus the soul, it is difficult to find a stable, irreducible value to assign to a human being, or for that human being to assign to herself. That great global economic engine, irresistible in theory as well as in fact, which made mere nostalgia of every countervailing interest and loyalty, was unstoppable until it was stopped. Now contagion is the great force active in the world, with consequences for the economy and the globe that we cannot yet foresee. The claims that were made for totalized economic determinism are exposed as naive. While these claims governed, we collectively did great harm to essential institutions, notably to the colleges and universities who taught the humanities, the very tradition of learning Dante and so many after him saw as food for the soul. The thought that things of true goodness and value could be joyfully given and joyfully received, that the giving and the receiving and the nourishment and the company of friends would work to perfect the souls of us all. This is remote from the discipline of controlled panic that made desperate sense to us 2 years ago. Let us say that the engrossing faith in the hegemony of laissez-faire economics has been shaken by the turbulence that has suddenly afflicted the globe. If it has required a certain indifference to our souls, even alienation from them, to have enlisted ourselves in this wholly immoral, often brutal regime of wealth production, it is only more remarkable that most of us were driven by both the threat and the fact of declining prosperity. The sages in the business schools told us that our economic behavior was driven by rational choice. It took a pathogen, an enforced solitude, to make us reconsider. Now that we have time and occasion to think things over, we might begin to invite our souls again to offer the generous pleasures of learning and teaching of the humanities that our civilization has traditionally promised, whose value and benefit it has always felt. Thank you.
thank you very much to Marilyn Robinson for this wonderful lecture, and my role today is primarily that of a sort of respondent to the topics covered by Marilyn Robinson, and I must confess that I feel, to say the less, ashamed to speak after such a prestigious lecturer and to discuss such a rich and inspiring paper, the paper that she has just given. I shall speak in English, and afterwards I shall just summarize or translate roughly what I've just said in English. Quindi ho semplicemente iniziato confessando il mio imbarazzo sostanzialmente nel parlare dopo Marilyn Robinson, che è acuito dal fatto che Marilyn Robinson ci ha regalato una conferenza a mio avviso magistrale, che è difficile riassumere e discutere in poche parole, ma tuttavia per il ruolo che devo ricoprire questa sera ci proverò da par mio. Just to carry on in English, being as I am a scholar that spends the most of his time studying Dante as an author that lived and worked in a cultural environment that is substantially different from ours, what I have appreciated the most in Marilyn Robinson's talk is, without doubt, her capacity to discuss the afterlife of Dante in the Western culture with a constant balance between the importance of Dante's thoughts and works to us on the one hand, and on the other the specificity of Dante's own intellectual formation, Dante's own culture, and Dante's own way of being a poet. And I believe that this balance between these two apparently distant features of any lecture on Dante is the key to understand what, at least in my opinion, is a great contribution, an inspiring contribution of Marilyn Robinson talk, i.e. The fact that she was perfectly able to discuss the overarching theme of Dante's afterlife in Western culture from a peculiar perspective, which is, to summarize roughly and hopefully not too wrongly, Dante's importance to us as part of a broader Western tradition. And this is undoubtedly one of the keys to better understand Dante's importance today without being disrespectful of the specificity of Dante's culture, time and thoughts. Ripeto, in italiano cercherò di riassumere più che tradurre letteralmente quello che dico, anche perché cerco di fare il mio bravo lavoro da respondent parlando a braccio, cioè avendo ascoltato il discorso e maturato alcune considerazioni mentre lo ascoltavo. Dicevo che forse l'aspetto che più mi ha colpito in quanto studioso sostanzialmente convinto della totale, in italiano sono un po' più spinto rispetto all'inglese, della totale estraneità della cultura di Dante rispetto alla nostra. Dante è un oggetto altro da noi, e quindi studioso che prova a spendere la maggior parte del suo tempo studiando questa diversità, quindi studiando Dante come un oggetto altro. Ecco, da questa prospettiva quello che mi ha colpito maggiormente nel talk di Marilyn Robinson è stata la sua capacità, a mio avviso straordinaria, di discutere la fortuna di Dante, che è un tema che sembra vetusto e privo di sbocchi originali, da una prospettiva assolutamente peculiare e originale, la cui chiave mi è sembrato il bilanciamento, la grande capacità di bilanciare due aspetti apparentemente contraddittori: l'importanza di Dante oggi, che è un'importanza ineludibile da un lato, e dall'altro appunto quella che è la specificità della cultura di Dante. E il modo in cui Marilyn Robinson è riuscita a mantenere questo bilanciamento credo sia quello di aver adottato la prospettiva più giusta per parlare di Dante oggi, che è quella di considerare l'importanza di Dante nei confronti della nostra cultura, della cultura di noi in quanto individui che vivono nel più ampio contesto di una tradizione occidentale. I shall move to English again to try to better define what I have suggested to consider the most relevant feature of Marilyn Robinson talk, i.e. this balance between Dante's importance, not afterlife, but importance, and Dante's specificity, and to sum up, without just summarizing all the topics covered by Marilyn Robinson, I shall say that this balance is, as anticipated, the key to look at Dante as an author that is important to us also beyond a scholarly environment. And this balance allowed Marilyn Robinson to provide a definition of Dante as an author that posed himself a set of problems, of questions that are similar to those that we are called to face in our everyday life as men and women of our culture, which is a Western culture. And in this case, under this regard, I feel that the stress that Marilyn Robinson put on notions such as that of love are extremely interesting and important, but also the idea of, if I don't get it wrong, the idea that she provided us with, i.e. that Dante, in a sense, shaped a spiritual representation of our own spiritual cast. And this probably is the perspective that I have personally appreciated the most of this talk. Per tradurre o riassumere quello che ho appena detto, ho provato a definire meglio quello che avevo chiamato il bilanciamento tra la specificità di Dante e la nostra e la sua importanza per noi in quanto uomini della nostra contemporaneità. Bene, credo che sia molto efficace la prospettiva che ha adottato Marilyn Robinson, cioè quella di considerare Dante in maniera apparentemente semplice come un uomo, un intellettuale, un poeta che si è posto di fronte a delle questioni, a dei temi, a dei problemi che sono comuni, pur nelle differenze con a quelli che dobbiamo fronteggiare noi nella nostra esperienza quotidiana, e in particolare in questa, diciamo, nell'ambito di questa apparentemente semplice prospettiva trovo molto stimolante l'idea, se non ho compreso male il ragionamento di Marilyn Robinson, di guardare a Dante come a un poeta che ha fornito alla civiltà occidentale una rappresentazione del percorso spirituale, nel senso più ampio e meno connotato del termine, dell'aggettivo, di ciascun uomo. In questo senso appunto si contestualizzano i commenti di Marilyn Robinson sull'utilizzo, sulla riflessione dantesca riguardo all'amore e ad altri temi. Under this regard, I feel that are of particular interest the remarks made by Marilyn Robinson on the theme of knowledge, the theme of knowledge, and on the quest for knowledge that Dante undertook in the 14th century, and that we are called to undertake in our everyday life as academics, as students, or as simply readers of our own world. And I feel that this perspective is particularly important today, given that we live, as we all know, in a world in which the memory of our cultural past is, in a sense, questioned constantly, and even within the universities, when it comes to define the content of teaching, and it is very, very contemporary, the perspective that Marilyn Robinson gave us by pairing Dante's Convivio Dante's banquet and the architecture of American universities. In particolare dicevo che in questa ampia serie di problemi e di questioni trovo particolarmente interessante, o meglio importante per noi oggi, il discorso che Marilynne Robinson ha fatto sul tema della conoscenza, della ricerca della conoscenza da parte di Dante a partire dal convivio, e trovo particolarmente stimolante il parallelo che lei ha fatto con, oltre che la propria esperienza di formazione, anche il contesto universitario, le biblioteche, le università, eccetera. E trovo che sia particolarmente importante questo tipo di prospettiva proprio perché ci troviamo a vivere in un mondo in cui volenti o nolenti è proprio la memoria culturale del nostro passato, della conoscenza che possiamo ereditare dal nostro passato, che viene a volte sorprendentemente messa in dubbio, anche quando si arriva a dover definire il contenuto di un insegnamento anche a livello universitario. Ed evidentemente tutto questo è importante considerarlo non nel contesto di una memoria di breve termine, ma nel contesto di una memoria di lungo termine, che porta anche a affrontare il problema della conoscenza, di cosa si deve desiderare di conoscere, anche avendo a mente il pensiero di un poeta, di un intellettuale come Dante, che della ricerca aristotelica della conoscenza ha fatto uno dei capisaldi della propria produzione. I shall do the other way around. By summarizing in English what I've just said in Italian, because I've added in Italian a couple of things, and more specifically I've added that I feel that it is important to face and to discuss the problem of knowledge nowadays within the universities and beyond the universities, adopting a perspective that is not linked to a sort of short memory that is not aware of the long Western tradition to which we belong, but to a tradition that, as Marilynne Robinson wonderfully explained to us, encompasses also a poet and an intellectual like Dante that assumed the Aristotelian quest or desire for knowledge as a pivotal point of his intellectual and poetical career. I have promised myself not to be long, and I've been even longer than I wished, but I felt to spend a few words not on the specific points addressed by Marilynne Robinson, but on what I believe is the wonderful perspective that she adopted to discuss a challenging theme as the importance of Dante to us today. And I feel, if I may suggest a comparison, that under this regard Marilynne Robinson gave us today a wonderful example of what is a typically American tendency to read Dante as someone who found himself in the same situation in which we are nowadays. While I was listening to Marilynne Robinson, I constantly thought about the 19th century American Dante criticism that was based on the idea that Dante's journey from sin to salvation can be effectively compared to the voyage that brought the first Americans from Europe to America. And this is the perspective that ultimately ended up in Singleton's interpretation of Dante, which not by chance is based on a reading of the psalm in Ex to Israel de Egipto. Well, Marilynne Robinson managed, in my opinion, to locate herself in this tendency, American tendency to read Dante as an author that is extremely important to us if we want to fully understand our present and current times. And this is the reason why she managed to locate Dante's afterlife within Western culture up to her own life and up to our sort of COVID-19 affected world in which we are forced to live. Ora viene la parte più complessa, cioè tradurre quello che ho appena detto, che appunto avendo parlato a braccio non ricordo parola per parola, ma il concetto chiave che vorrei far passare è appunto quello del fatto che Marilyn Robinson, con un'operazione apparentemente semplice, perché ha avuto la grande maestria di essere chiara, lucida, è riuscita a darci un grande esempio di una tradizione tipicamente americana che rimonta al dantismo ottocentesco americano, che è quella appunto di leggere Dante come una persona che, avendo affrontato i nostri stessi problemi, ci può insegnare qualcosa su come affrontare a nostra volta problemi analoghi. Mi riferisco chiaramente ai primi coloni americani che appunto vengono paragonati in questa prospettiva a Dante, che viaggia dalla selva del peccato fino alla salvezza, e che è una prospettiva che non è un'appropriazione indebita né sterile, se ha portato quasi un secolo dopo, un po' meno di un secolo dopo, un grande studioso come Singleton a proporre la propria lettura della commedia basata appunto su il Salmo in exito Israele d'Egitto. Ecco, bene, credo che Marilyn Robinson sia riuscita a collocarsi in maniera originale in questa tradizione, offrendoci appunto non una lezione sulla fortuna di Dante, non una lezione sull'importanza di Dante, ma una lezione sul nostro ruolo in quanto lettori di Dante nel contesto di una tradizione di lungo periodo, che è appunto quella che ci aiuta a poter collocare l'importanza di Dante da Chaucer a Shakespeare fino alla vita stessa di Marilyn Robinson, fino ai giorni che ci troviamo a vivere nell'ambito dell'emergenza pandemica. I want to just end up by apologizing to Marilyn Robinson because I've been too long and probably I have misled a lot of things that she kindly said, but again, this was my humble way to thank her for her insightful lecture.
So thank you, but probably you would like to say something else, or?
I would like to say something else.
Yeah, because
Are you speaking to me?
we don't, I don't hear.
Yes, my colleague was just asking if you want to make a final remark to, the whole event, or if you have any further comments that you want to share, or not.
Are you speaking to me?
Yes.
All right. Yes, well, I would say that the thing that was most striking to me in reading, Dante's writing outside the Divine Comedy was the very great generosity of his mind and his impulses. One of the things that I think must have been wonderful is that he could actually hear the beauty of the spoken language, that it was so compelling to him that it really becomes the subject of his great poem. That seems to me a very enviable thing that perhaps we could approximate in our own experience in some way, if we had the kind of sensibility that allowed us to experience what is beautiful, what is the spontaneous art that arises out of common experience. I'm very interested in early vernacular writing, and of course he's absolutely central to that. But I love the generosity that comes with it, the embrace of ordinary life and the acknowledgement of the profundity of ordinary life. That's, I don't know if that's, I don't think it's an American impulse so much as it is a writer's impulse to notice the extreme good fortune of someone whose embrace of the world is so generous as his always is.
Thank you very much to Marilyn Robinson, and I do feel that this way to conclude by stressing, if I got it correctly, Dante's generosity as, I mean, the main gift that Dante gives to us is probably the best way to conclude this, or to add a final remark to this encounter. È difficile tradurre, diciamo letteralmente, parola per parola, quello che ha appena detto Marilyn Robinson, ma se posso permettermi di sintetizzarlo, riassumerlo a beneficio del pubblico italiano, credo che sia l'elemento più rilevante e più importante sia l'accento che è stato posto sulla generosità di Dante, ecco, su questa parola che Marilyn Robinson ha usato in più occasioni durante la sua lezione, ha voluto riprendere adesso, e credo che sia giusto appunto chiudere con questa parola, perché sia alla luce del talk che ha fatto Marilyn Robinson, sia alla luce di quest'ultimo commento, è appunto questa la grande parola che costituisce il centro di gravità attorno alla quale appunto Marilyn Robinson ha costruito questa idea di Dante, che ci ha appunto esposto così brillantemente nel suo talk.
Bene, allora mi avvio a concludere ringraziando anche io sono rimasta molto colpita. Marilyn Robinson has a deep knowledge of Dante's opera. Marilyn Robinson conosce davvero in maniera profonda l'opera di Dante, not only the Commedia, but the Convivio, the Vita Nova, the Vulgari Eloquenzia, and so it was a great opportunity to hear your lecture. And I just want to say thank you to Marilyn Robinson, and I would like to invite Marilyn Robinson in Ravenna, and we are waiting for you in Ravenna, but not online, in presence as soon as possible. Thank you very much for this opportunity, Ms. Robinson.
Thank you.
And thank you. Grazie a tutti e a tutte coloro che sono stati connessi con noi, e grazie anche a Nicolò. Grazie. Thank you.
Grazie anche da parte mia. Thank you also from me.
Well, thank you both.